So, it's kind of a general question, but what is the fascination with psychopaths? Why are people so interested in it?
I think people are really interested in psychopaths because they are, on the one hand, so normal. They're so kind of like us on the surface, but actually they are radically different. And I think that, you know, when we look at society today, I think the figures are something like there's one CCTV camera for every 14 people in the UK. That's a hell of a lot of CCTV cameras. I think there's something like 2 billion people on Facebook. You've got social media. Our world is constantly being monitored and our behaviour is constantly under scrutiny. And I think that there is something about all of us that just wishes that we could just kind of stick two fingers up to society and do what we want without any kind of care for what other people might think. And I think that if there's one definitive characteristic that separates psychopaths out from the rest of it, it's that they do not care what other people feel. I mean, I often ask people a question. I often say, you know, imagine that, you know, you had 1 hour in which you could do anything you wanted, but at the end of that hour, it would be as if nothing had ever happened. There would be no emotional comeback or any kind of real-world comeback, legal comeback or anything. What would it be? And most people, when you ask that question, fall into two different kinds. They fall into the kind where they would say, well, I would go and declare my unrequited love for someone that I just didn't quite have the guts to do, or I would wreak terrible revenge on someone that had done me down. And I think we all have that we all have these kind of desires, we all have these kinds of wishes that we, you know, for whatever reason, are kind of, we suppress and we're kind of scared of acting on. For psychopaths, it really is like that. There are no barriers, there are no moral breaks. And I think deep down in all of us, there is a kind of an existential angst that, you know, we have this, but we can't act that way because of the consequences of that we would have to face in society. Psychopaths do not have that fear. So I think we have a kind of certain psychopath envy, I suppose, is what I would say, because on the one hand they're so normal, but on the other hand they have this ability to just do what they want, which I think all of us probably secretly crave.
So, a lot of people's idea of a psychopath comes from Hollywood, comes from the negative kind of serial killer side. A lot of people will be quite surprised to find out there is such a thing as a good psychopath. So, what kind of constitutes a good psychopath, as it were? You know, where is it positive?
Well, I think when I think you raise a good question. I think when most people hear the word psychopath, instantly, you know, thoughts of Hannibal Lecter start creeping across their minds. But when psychologists like myself, experts in the field, talk about psychopaths, we're actually referring to a distinct subset of people with a specific subgroup of personality characteristics, such as ruthlessness, fearlessness, coolness under pressure, focus, charm, charisma, those kind of signature deficits in conscience and empathy. Now, the key here is to think of those characteristics as being the dials on a studio mixing desk, which you can turn up and down in various combinations. And as soon as you start thinking of it like that, you arrive at two conclusions. The first conclusion is that there's no one definitive correct setting at which these mixing desk dials can be set at, but rather a little bit like height or weight. It's on a spectrum along which each of us have our place. And the second conclusion that you can come to is that there are always going to be certain professions that by their very nature are going to demand that some of these dials are turned up a little bit higher than average, might demand what I call precision engineered psychopathy. And these are generally professions where there's higher risk involved. So, you know, special forces, surgery, business to CEOs, actually a lot in media and advertising as well, where there's a lot of competition for ideas. Now, the key for me, if you are a psychopath, a pure psychopath, and you have all of those dials cranked up to max and you cannot regulate them, you are absolutely going to be toxic. You are going to ruin your own life and you're going to ruin the lives of people you come into contact with. The key is to have these dials turned up in the right combination, in the right context, at the right levels and with the right intentions. That's key. And if you're able to regulate those dials and turn them up in the right context, in the right combinations, that is when you start getting into what we might call a good psychopath. If you're stuck on max, and you are acting in a way which is detrimental to success and helping other people thrive and yourself thrive, that's when it starts turning toxic.
So one quote I've heard, you may know where it's from, is that if you start to worry that you are a psychopath, you probably aren't one, because part of being a psychopath is that kind of lack of almost self-reflection. Yeah. How much truth would you say there is in that for psychopathy?
I think there's a lot of truth in that. I get emails from a lot of people saying to me, well, I'm worried that I might be a psychopath. And I always reply saying, well, take it from me, I don't think you are, because if you're worried about being a psychopath, you're definitely not. Psychopaths don't worry. Psychopaths have an understaffed amygdala. The amygdala is a small part of the brain, about the size of your thumbnail, right in the middle, which is basically the emotional control tower of the brain. It's involved in processing emotion. And in psychopaths, it is understaffed. That is why they are able to be very cool under immense pressure, where the rest of us might be, really, really anxious. So psychopaths, generally speaking, don't experience that kind of anxiety that the rest of us feel. They also, broadly speaking, have very little self-insight into their condition as well. If they do things that are wrong and they're caught for it and punished, they usually externalise the blame onto their victims. Well, they were asking for it, it was their fault. So if you combine the fact that psychopaths don't really have much self-insight with the fact that they don't really worry either, if somebody comes up to you and says, I'm worried I'm a psychopath, I think pretty good chance they're not.
And you mentioned in your talk about the concept that psychopaths are a lot better at spotting people who've done something wrong. They can spot that kind of thing. Do you think there's an aspect of that is down to the fact that more emotionally active people bring their own kind of subjectivity to a situation, whereas a psychopath is looking at the facts of it, like, some people may see an old lady, she hasn't killed her husband, whereas other people go, oh, she's actually furtive. I
think the main thing that psychopaths seem to be very good at spotting vulnerability in people. Ted Bundy famously said he could tell a good victim simply from the way she walked, and there is scientific evidence out there which suggests that psychopaths are very good at spotting vulnerability in people. I think that there is a very good reason for that, which is much simpler, and that is the fact that psychopaths are very good at picking victims. And a psychopath is not going to pick a victim that is going to cause them undue trouble and hassle. They're going to pick someone who's going to be a walkover. One psychopath I interviewed in a high security unit actually says, that it's a little bit like, the way he used to operate. Was a little bit like electricity going around a circuit. He would take the path of least resistance. So he would zone in on vulnerable women who he could tell were vulnerable, and he was a very charming guy, and he caught them in his web, and he was a serial con man, and cleaned them out, and destroyed their lives. So psychopaths are very good at zoning in on vulnerability because it suits their purposes, and I think it's pretty much as simple as that.
So you mentioned as well about the concept that they're using sort of positive reinforcement to attempt to almost kind of train psychopaths more than, I suppose, cure them. But I believe there was always a study that led to the fact that actually that kind of trains us to be more manipulative to get what they want.
It can do that. It can do, yeah. And I think it's very much the least worst option. I mean, if you have people, we're talking about adolescents here who could very easily kill someone. They have a completely different moral compass to the rest of us. You're faced with people who could easily take people's lives, who could certainly make, and who do make other people's lives a misery. And these kinds of people are the very people that do not respond to sanctions and punishment. You have to, in some way, be able to deal with that and address that situation. Now, it does seem that adopting a reinforcement schedule where you reward good behaviour from these people, so you are appealing to their reward centeredness. That can definitely save people's lives, but it is a real and genuine criticism that you are actually not really changing the person inside. All you're doing is addressing the superficial behaviour, and that can reward people to be more manipulative and get what they want, because actually they know what the currency is in kind of getting attention and playing the game, as it were. So I think you're absolutely right. At the moment, it's the least worst option. But I think the main thing is, if you can, in certain situations, control behaviour and make life more manageable for people around these people, I think that is a valid contribution.
And finally, where does Hollywood get it wrong? Because we see all these famous psychopaths that aren't actually psychopaths. So where are the main areas they do get it wrong?
I think that I think if you take somebody like Hannibal Lecter, for instance, you know, that kind of, it's almost like a caricature of psychopathy. You know, the staring eyes, the absolute cold blood. I mean, there were elements of Hannibal Lecter's portrayal there were elements of Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of Hannibal Lecter which were very accurate. But it's just that it always seems to be a little bit overdone. You don't get that kind of, I suppose, consistency of behaviour all the time in a psychopath. Although I have to say that the staring eyes is something which Hollywood gets absolutely right, but for reasons that they don't realise. It is true that there is something rather odd about psychopathic eye contact. But that's to do, we think, with the fact that psychopaths tend to blink rather less than the rest of us. On average, a minute, they might blink three or four times less. And the reason for that tends to be related to what we talked about earlier, lack of anxiety. Blink reflex is directly related to how anxious you were. If you remember Bill Clinton when he was on television being interviewed about the Monica Lewinsky scandal, his blink rate went up something like 200% because he was telling a lie. And actually when we lie, we do tend to blink more because we're anxious about telling a lie. Psychopaths would because they don't get anxious. Now, because of the fact that psychopaths are generally less anxious than the rest of us, they are going to blink slightly less than the rest of us because blink reflex is an index of anxiety. And all you need to do is blink slightly less in the space of a minute, and actually you get the impression of someone who has staring eyes and who can come across rather unnervingly and rather dominant.